Hello, and welcome to the Middle East Forum speaker webinar series and podcast. I'm Stacy Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Jeffrey Herf, Distinguished University Professor of Modern European History at the University of Maryland and author, join us to discuss his latest book, Israel's Moment, International Support for and Opposition to Establishing the Jewish State, 1945 to 1949. Professor Herf will speak for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Professor Jeffrey Herf.
Ms. Roman, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to an audience of the Middle East Forum. And in 15 minutes, I will present a succinct summary of a book that is about 463 pages in text and another 30 or so in notes. There's a great deal of detail that is new based on archival work, and for people who are, even for people who, such as this audience, that is very familiar, certainly with contemporary issues in the Middle East, I think the book offers some fresh and interesting new perspectives. There are four major themes that I want to address. First, while President Harry Truman's support for the establishment of the Jewish state is famous and well known, and his decision to support the partition resolution in November of 1949 and to recognize the new state of Israel are familiar to this audience. The support, the diplomatic and military support for establishing the Jewish state from the Soviet bloc, from the Soviet Union, from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from Ukrainian SSR, was more important, more consequential. Israel's moment was that moment, a brief moment in the history of Soviet foreign policy, when both for power political reasons of driving the British out of the Middle East or trying to, but also I think the emotions of anti-Nazism and anti-fascism immediately after the war were still a factor. The book draws attention in particular at the United Nations and regarding arms deliveries to the role of the Soviet Union and Soviet bloc. And that raises a second issue, which is that due to the understandable focus on Truman's support, there has historians have not paid sufficient attention to the very consequential and unrelenting opposition to the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine on the part of the United States State Department, the Pentagon, and the Central Intelligence Agency, as well as, of course, the British Foreign Office. Israel's moment presents more evidence of that opposition, and it was an opposition that did not come only from the famous State Department Arabists, such as Loy Henderson and others who had served in Arab capitals as ambassadors or American representatives. It became an Anglo-American consensus represented in London by Foreign Minister Ernst Bevin. And in Washington, that consensus extended to the Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, former five-star general, George C. Marshall, and the first director of the policy planning staff, George F. Kennan, who by that point was famous in the United States as the author of the famous long telegram regarding the containment of the Soviet Union. And it was through Marshall and then Kennan and Deputy Secretary Robert Love that the opposition became a consensus within the State Department. The opposition rested on two fundamental assumptions. First, that because the establishment of the Jewish state would antagonize the Arabs, it would undermine Western access to oil, Arab oil, at a time when Secretary Marshall's focus was on the economic reconstruction of Western Europe. The whole drama about the establishment of the State of Israel from the perspective of the State Department and the Pentagon was a sideshow, as the main strategic issue of the immediate post-war years and the beginning of the Cold War was the future of Europe and Japan as well. But let's focus on Europe. That was Marshall's preoccupation, evident in the famous Marshall Plan. And so in that sense, the establishment of the Jewish state was an irritant. And the second reason for opposition was that the State Department, the Pentagon, the British Foreign Office all viewed a Jewish state in Palestine as a Trojan horse for Soviet and communist influence in the Middle East. They argued that the Arab states, being more conservative and were more immune to Soviet and communist influence, but the Jews coming, including many refugees coming from Europe, would be more likely to advance Soviet and communist interests. So establishing the Jewish state would undermine the new policy of the Cold War of containment. The third theme concerns American politics, and it's about who supported and who opposed, or who were the loudest supporters, rather, of the establishment of the Jewish state. And while there were Republicans, most famously Senator Robert Taft, and some younger Rockefeller Republicans such as Jacob Javits, who supported the establishment of the Jewish state, overwhelmingly the strongest support in the United States for the Zionist project came from liberals, such as the editor of the New Republic, Henry Wallace, the editor of The Nation magazine, Friedrich Kirchway, the journalist I.F. Stone, the then left liberal New York Post, and the left-leaning Popular Front Daily, PM. And in Washington, the leading political figures who supported the Jewish state were Senator Robert F. Wagner of New York, a lion of the New Deal and author of the Social Security Act, and the Brooklyn congressman, the Democratic congressman, Emanuel Seller. So in that sense, in American politics, the support came most emphatically from the left liberal side. Ben-Gurion Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu's father, those of you who are familiar with Ben-Gurion Netanyahu's important scholarship on the Spanish Inquisition know that he had a distinguished career as a historian. Ben-Gurion Netanyahu in the American Zionist Emergency Council was involved, and the American Zionist Emergency Council had close affiliations with liberal and left liberal newspapers and organizations, especially in New York. So these liberal and left liberal origins of Zionist support in the United States are important to keep in mind. And the fourth point I'd like to make is a point about political language. This audience understands that the meaning of famous words like liberalism and conservatism, imperialism and anti-imperialism, racism and anti-racism, historians and many in this audience, I'm sure, also understand that the meaning of these words change over time. In the immediate years after World War II and the Holocaust, it was broadly understood, believed, that Zionism was a form of anti-racism, and that the Zionist movement was an anti-imperialist movement. It was a movement that required an end to British rule in Mandate Palestine. And so it was viewed by many on the left in Europe and the United States as part of a broad anti-colonial revolt of the post-World War II era, in which the British and French empires, but not only, gave way to many new independent states, of which the Jewish state would be one. But there was another element that had to do with racism and anti-racism that was very much on the mind of American liberals and leftists in 1945-46, and that had to do with the importance of Hashim ben al-Husseini the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a figure that is familiar to this audience, so I need not belabor who he was. But he had a cousin who is a little less familiar, perhaps, named Jamal Husseini. And Jamal Husseini is an important figure because he was the representative of the Arab Higher Committee, the political organization that represented the Palestine Arabs at the United Nations, beginning in 1947. And Jamal Husseini gave a speech in London in January 47, and then another speech at the United Nations in September of 47, where the Palestine Arabs were well represented by Jamal Husseini, an eloquent and powerful speaker. And I mentioned Jamal Husseini because both in London and then in New York in 1947, he said that the Arab world is a territorial continuity inhabited by a homogeneous population with one national outlook. As such, it is free from serious frictions and a natural bulwark for peace. Homogeneity in race has always been the natural basis for mutual understanding and community of interests. The creation of an alien Jewish state in Palestine means the destruction of this territorial continuity and national homogeneity. The book gives more detail about Jamal Husseini's homogeneity and race speech of 1947. And I mention it because the combination of the Soviet bloc and the PLO conducted a fantastically successful propaganda campaign from the 1960s up to, well, the end of the Cold War and in BDS efforts afterwards, that suggested that Zionism was a form of racism and that the nationalism of the Palestine Arabs was a form of anti-racism. So one of the things that Israel's moment is an attempt to do is to recall the racism and anti-Semitism of some of the founding texts of the nationalism of the Palestine Arabs. And that is a long overdue discussion. And I regard it as an important contribution to the book. I have another 3 minutes. I'm going to follow Stacy's directions here and leave time for questions. And so I think for this audience, I'm going to speak more as a fellow researcher and colleague. I found working in the publicly available documents of the United Nations to be absolutely fascinating. Those of you who've read the UN yearbooks or have used the official online system of the United Nations know what I mean. The contributions of Soviet bloc diplomats from May of 47 to May of 49 was remarkable. Alfred Fedorkiewicz, a survivor of Auschwitz, was the Polish representative to the United Nations and gave a very moving speech about the Holocaust and his decision to support the partition plan as a result. Vasyl Tarasenko was the Ukrainian SSR's representative on the rotating seat in the Security Council of spring of 48 and 49. And Vasyl Tarasenko, with Soviet Ambassador Andrei Gromyko, made common cause with Israel's Abba Eban and Foreign Minister Moshe Sharett in opposing the Bernadotte Plan, which would have deprived Israel of the Negev Desert. The Bernadotte Plan was supported by Britain and the United States. Two more points. The work in the archives of the State Department and the Pentagon has led to a book that includes important detail about that Anglo-American anti-Zionist consensus that I referred to. In January and February of 1948, George Kennan, as director of the policy planning staff, wrote memos arguing that the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine would be a disaster for American national security interests, both for reasons of undermining the policy of containment of communism and undermining access to oil. And Kennan, those of you who know or have read Kennan's work, was his memos were typically brilliant and eloquent and compelling. as to why this Zionist project would be a disaster for American national security. I disagree with them completely. But this was George Kennan. This was not someone to be dismissed as someone who had gone native because they spent too much time in the Arab world or something like that. And Kennan had been appointed by Marshall. So President Truman was really up against the leaders and very prestigious and famous leaders of the American national security establishment when he recognized the new state of Israel. But there were limits to what the president was able or willing to do. And one of those limits was provide arms to the Jews, which the United States refused to do at a time when the Jews needed the weapons. And I will conclude this 15-minute compressed version of Israel's moment with an anecdote, which I hope will perhaps become a bit of a famous anecdote. In May of 1949, the State Department was becoming increasingly irritated with David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharett. And they were irritated because they were insisting that the brand new state of Israel allow the Palestine refugees to return to Israel. And Ben-Gurion said, well, some of them can come back, certainly, as long as they sign a peace agreement with us. Yes, we would love to have them back, but at the moment, they're at war with us. So you're asking us to bring people back who want to attempt to destroy us? No. Why don't you put some pressure on them to sign a peace treaty and mean it? And and they were speaking with James McDonald, who was a friend of theirs, the first American ambassador to Israel, and who is sympathetic to Zionist claims, who had been appointed by the president. And McDonald was disliked intensely in the State Department for his pro-Zionist views. But they trusted McDonald. And this is what David Ben-Gurion said to him, according to McDonald's notes. About the United States. The November 29 resolution was never carried out by the UN, the US, or the Middle East states. He could not recall any strong action by the United States or United Nations to enforce the November 29 resolution or to prevent aggression from Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, and Iraq. Instead, the arms embargo encouraged the aggressors against Israel, whose very existence was in danger. And then he said, had the Jews in Palestine or the Israelis waited on the United States or the United Nations, they would have been exterminated. I know many of the people on this call or this Zoom session have heard for decades that Israel was a creation of American imperialism. So whatever virtues or faults the state of Israel has, it was not the product of American imperialism, far from it. That alone is something that I think needs to be much more widely understood. I think that the book makes a significant contribution to changing the way many people think about the origins of the state of Israel. So I think that's 17 minutes. I've gone 2 minutes over my time, but now I'd very much like to hear your comments and questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So the first question we have from David Levine is, Trump's daughter, Margaret, has denied any importance of Eddie Jacobson's Truman. Wow, sorry. A former business partner in persuading Truman to support Israel's statehood. Can you comment on this?
There's a fine book about Truman and Eddie Jacobson by Alison Ronald Radosh, Safe Haven for These People. I think, Harry Truman, I'm going to reveal a deep, dark secret, was a human being. So he was a power political politician. He was the author of the Truman Doctrine. He was beginning to fight the Cold War. He was also a human being, and he also was a very religious man. And Truman, in that sense, I view as comparable to Churchill and Roosevelt in the sense that they all are representatives of Western Protestantism in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and they all recognize the extent to which Nazism was both an attack on Christianity, but it also had something to do with interpretations of Christianity. So yes, when Eddie Jacobson made that appeal to his friend, the president, I'm sure that it struck an emotional core, but the emotional core, I think, was there in Truman's also uh, deep understanding of the Christian tradition and his view of Christianity as a religion that was deeply indebted to Judaism, not certainly antagonistic to Judaism.
Thank you. And elaborating on that a bit more, an anonymous attendee asked, the common perception is that President Truman's recognition was crucial to the creation and survival of Israel. But you just read a document in which Ben-Gurion said that Truman's arms embargo could have led to the extermination of Israel if the Israelis had not received weapons from the Soviets. So has Truman's pro-Israel reputation been overstated?
Truman's pro-Israel reputation has not been overstated, but there is a romance about the extent to which Truman's, well, I guess yes, a little bit. I mean, he would have had to fire George Marshall, George Kennan, and Robert Lovell, and James Forrestal. That would have been at the same time that he was depending on these very same individuals to launch the Cold War. That I think that he made the calculation that that beginning launching the Cold War was more important than providing arms for the Jews. So there's a romance in the United States that projects the American alliance with Israel that emerged after 1967 back into the 1940s, and the United States was Truman finally got fed up with Marshall and Kennan, and he brought policy back into the White House regarding Israel. But in the 1950s and up to 1967, the United States had kept its distance. France was Israel's most important ally in its first 20 years.
Fascinating. Thank you. Philip Getz asks, would you elaborate a bit about why Israel was seen as a threat containment?
Because both the British and the American intelligence agencies and diplomats abroad made the argument that the Soviet Union was sending NKVD agents in the refugee stream to Palestine, and that the Jews coming to Palestine from Europe had connections to the socialist and communist movements, and that the more that Gromyko and Tarasenko and Peterkevich and the Czechs at the United Nations supported Israel, the more the State Department came to the conclusion there must be something to this connection between Zionism and communism.
Thank you. Jerry Danzig asked, did the socialism of Ben-Gurion and the Kibbutz affect the U.S. attitude toward Israel?
That's an important question. It's very interesting. As many of you know, the not only the CIA but the State Department understood that to win the Cold War in Europe, the United States had to have support from parties of the center left, and if the Cold War was fought by Catholic conservative parties, that the Soviet Union would have a chance to win the political battle in France and Italy in particular. So the United States made appeals to German Social Democrats, French Socialists, Italian Socialists, British Labor, all center left, some of them founders of the post-war welfare state and all that. It's interesting that they didn't see Ben-Gurion as a similar kind of a figure. That essentially his politics were identical regarding social and economic policy to his foe Ernst Bevin or Kurt Schumacher or the French socialists, but they didn't. In the higher offices of the State Department, people were not making the case, not about the kibbutz, but about the reality of socialists who were they wouldn't perhaps use the term anti-communist, but who were non-communist and who would not be a vehicle for Soviet influence. They didn't make that argument. Clark Clifford, Truman's lawyer, Ben-Gurion Netanyahu, Emanuel Seller, Robert Wagner, uh, uh, the others in America, in Washington and New York, they made those arguments. Definitely, they made those arguments, but those arguments were not decisive in the halls of power.
So one of our viewers asks, in the view of the very strong opposition that Truman had within his government, what was the one turning point that made Truman change his mind towards the establishment of the state of Israel?
The president was a busy man, right? So you can't keep track of everything. But on March 15th of 1948, Warren Austin, the American ambassador to the United States, gave a speech which was the result of an enormous amount of work within the policy planning staff in the State Department, that the United States should replace the partition resolution of 1949 with a trusteeship by the United States, Britain, and France over Palestine. And a trusteeship would preclude the establishment of a Jewish state. And at that point, Truman just blew his stack. He was furious because he recognized that Marshall and Kennan and the others just were making policy on their own and against his own wishes. And it was at that point, in March of 1948, that he pulled policy back into the White House, that Clifford becomes more important, and essentially that Kennan began to lose influence over policymaking. So that was the turning point.
Understand. And I suppose we are going to your first point of putting too much emphasis on Truman's support and not enough on the Soviet bloc.
Truman was a remarkable man. I don't mean to suggest anything. He was the one person in the administration, not on Capitol Hill or public, but who was both a Cold Warrior and a Zionist. There wasn't anyone else. There was Clifford, his lawyer, but he could look over at the Pentagon and the State Department, the CIA. No, they all were making the opposite argument. You got to choose. You want to fight the Cold War, or you want to support the Zionists. And Truman said, I want to do both. I'm going to do both. He did it.
Arnie Landy asks, why did Stalin support the creation of a Jewish state? The removal of the British from the Middle East is the usual answer, but the British had already left except for Palestine, and turning that over to the UN, they were committed to leaving. So why did Stalin support Israel?
Because the British were not committed to leaving the military bases in the Middle East. And they hoped that the war would turn out in a way that would give them military bases in the Negev, and that they could keep the Jewish state much smaller than it was intended to be, and that it was not a done deal. The war was yet to be won. No, the British had agreed to leave, but that didn't mean they had agreed to leave the region or leave Palestine completely. It wasn't a great deal. It didn't take an enormous amount of effort or time or money or whatever. Well, why not try? Maybe this is a way of weakening Western influence and getting control over the oil that Europe needs. Then in the first Israeli elections, the Communist Party, I think, got 3.5% of the vote, and the pro-Soviet, I think it was Mapam. I don't want to make a mistake or get the wrong party. But the pro-Soviet vote was about 13. I mean, they had other. They were not a communist party, but they were quote, as we say, soft on communism. But Ben-Gurion was able to form his first government with a coalition that didn't include either of those parties. And at that point, Stalin understood that his effort didn't work out, and that the new state of Israel was not going to be in his camp, as it were. And then he reverted to his own more natural anti-Semitism and the more conventional Marxism-Leninism too, because the Soviet policy of 1935-39, 1941-47 were exceptions in the longer history of Soviet foreign policy, in which the Soviet Union sought, for various reasons, alliances with the West. But that ended in 1940. in the fall of 1940, the summer of 1949, really, with the beginning of the purges.
Wonderful. And before we go, can you tell our viewers where we can find some more of your work?
Oh, well, it's all it's all there on Amazon. The Jewish Enemy is the study of Nazi propaganda during World War II in Germany. Nazi propaganda for the Arab world is the study of Nazi Germany's Arabic language efforts. Undeclared wars with Israel is a study of East German and Soviet bloc and West German leftist antagonism. Divided Memory, I think it may be back in print, is about history of the politics and memory of the Holocaust in East and West Germany. I'm a historian of modern German history, so this is my first book that's not about German history, but it's obviously about the aftermath, one aspect of the aftermath. All those they're in print and available, through the publishers or on Amazon. So thanks for asking.
Absolutely. And I also posted the link to your latest book in our chat.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Yeah. And I will be writing a paper. There'll be a paperback edition and a preface. And so for this audience, a very informed and engaged audience, any of your comments about the book or, please, my email is at the University of Maryland webpage, jherf@umd.edu. So if you have comments or criticisms or suggestions or whatever, I'd be glad to hear it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, we've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Professor Herf, for joining us today.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Of course. For our viewers, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.